In the late 1700s, France was a dominant European power, but its government operated on an outdated absolute monarchy and a rigid social hierarchy that was rapidly fracturing under its own weight. This diagram illustrates the old regime's social structure, the three estates. The massive third estate at the bottom holds the working population, peasants, merchants, and laborers. They have zero political power, yet they carry the entire tax burden to subsidize the tiny, privileged first and second estates, the clergy and the nobility. That tax money was disappearing fast. The French state was functionally bankrupt, crushed by enormous debts from foreign wars, including the American Revolution. Meanwhile, the royal court spent lavishly. The excessive luxury of the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles stood in stark contrast to an empty national treasury. This line graph maps out the cost of bread in Paris leading up to 1789. A series of terrible harvests caused prices to spike violently. Where the line hits these timeline markers, rapid inflation immediately translated abstract financial failures into literal starvation, bringing angry crowds into the streets. Facing state bankruptcy, deep systemic inequality, and widespread hunger created a highly volatile environment. The absolute monarchy faced a massive structural failure it could no longer contain. Desperate to avoid total default, King Louis XVI called a meeting of the Estates General to pass new taxes. But the voting structure was rigged. The clergy and nobility could easily outvote the massive Third Estate 2-1, blocking any meaningful reforms. Frustrated by this gridlock, the representatives of the Third Estate broke away. They declared themselves the National Assembly, gathered inside an indoor tennis court, and swore an oath not to leave until they had written a new constitution for France. Sensing a loss of control, the king began moving troops into Paris. Fearing an attack, the people sought weapons and marched on the Bastille. The violent collapse of this heavily fortified prison served as a direct physical strike against the king's authority. The unrest rapidly spilled into the countryside. During a period known as the Great Fear, terrified peasants raided manor houses and destroyed old feudal records. In response to the growing chaos, the assembly officially abolished the feudal system overnight. Within a matter of months, a chain reaction of financial and political crises had stripped the absolute monarchy of its power. For the first time in French history, true political sovereignty rested with the people. The assembly quickly drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It established a new political blueprint based on equality and free speech, though it notably excluded women and the millions of enslaved people in French colonies. Despite these political strides, the food crisis persisted. In October, thousands of hungry, angry women marched in the rain from Paris to Versailles. They breached the palace and physically forced the king and his family to move back to the capital, stripping him of his royal isolation. Now operating under the direct pressure of the Paris crowds, France attempted to stabilize. The goal was a constitutional monarchy, a fragile system where the king would remain on the throne, but his powers would be strictly limited by the new laws. That delicate balance shattered in June 1791. The king and his family disguised themselves and attempted to flee Paris in a carriage, hoping to reach loyalist forces at the border. They were recognized and captured in the town of Varennes. To the public, the king was no longer a reluctant partner. He was an active enemy of the nation. Adding to the domestic chaos, revolutionary France declared war on Austria and Prussia. As foreign troops marched toward the borders, paranoia gripped Paris. Citizens became convinced that hidden traitors were working from the inside to help the invading armies. The external threat of invasion, combined with the internal betrayal of the monarchy, erased any remaining middle ground. The moderate factions lost control, guaranteeing the country's pivot toward radical, escalating violence. In August 1792, revolutionaries stormed the royal palace. The monarchy was officially suspended, and France was declared a republic. Months later, King Louis XVI was put on trial for treason and sent to the guillotine, cutting off any possibility of return. This snap of France shows the immediate fallout. Massive coalition armies from neighboring monarchies pushed inward across the borders, determined to crush the new republic before its ideas could spread. At the same time, the Republic faced collapse from the inside. As we can see breaking out behind the front lines, massive internal rebellions erupted across the countryside, effectively trapping the revolutionary government in Paris. To hold the fracturing nation together, the radical Jacobin faction took control. Led by Maximilien Robespierre, the state institutionalized fear, using special tribunals and mass executions to purge anyone suspected of disloyalty. This period became known as the Reign of Terror. The government mobilized hundreds of thousands of citizens, rapidly building a massive army that successfully pushed back the foreign invaders. But even as the borders stabilized, the terror continued until frightened politicians finally turned on Robespierre and sent him to the guillotine. The state had weaponized the promise of liberty to justify the slaughter of its own citizens. The extreme political violence exhausted the nation and left a deep scar on the Republic. In the aftermath of the terror, a new government called the Directory took power. It was highly corrupt, politically weak, and entirely dependent on the military to suppress constant riots and uprisings in the streets. This reliance on the army created an opening for military leaders to gain immense political influence. One highly successful general, Napoleon Bonaparte, returned from his military campaigns, presenting himself as the only figure capable of restoring order to a broken country. In 1799, Napoleon launched a military coup. He overthrew the Directory and installed himself as first consul. The revolutionary tricolor gave way to the imperial eagle, effectively bringing the 10-year revolution to an end. The French Revolution successfully dismantled a centuries-old absolute monarchy and introduced the language of modern political rights. Yet its rapid descent into widespread violence demonstrated how easily the fight for liberty, when pushed to the breaking point, can collapse into a demand for dictatorship.